Hello, dear people, to the fifth episode of our monthly Reportercast for October 2022. I am Matej Roska, the journalist who owns Reporter.London, and this time we are doing something of a special edition, looking at a particular issue which I think deserves a lot more attention, although it is only indirectly connected to our usual mission of discussing and exposing economic crime, though this theme is certainly part of the mix. The issue is the Russia-occupied territory of Transnistria in the east of Moldova and within the country's recognized borders with Ukraine to the east and the river Dnistru to the west, acting as a de facto border. The capital is in Tiraspol, the largest city. This supposedly separatist enclave was created in 1992 after Russia invaded Moldova and waged a brief war because the country sought independence after the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And as our guest today knows all about it and is about to explain, not very much has changed since. However, the region has seen increasing tension and its rulers have been repressing dissent a lot harder since the onset of the Ukraine invasion by Russia in February this year, which I think requires attention from the international community. Our guest has been the chief negotiator in the peace process between Moldova's legitimate government in Chisinau and the separatists. He was a lead advisor on this issue for the US Embassy in Chisinau, and also he launched recently an NGO in Moldova to focus on the topic. The name of the organization is Initiative for Peace, based in Chisinau, and our esteemed guest's name is Alexandru Flenchea. Welcome to Reportercast, Alexandru.
Thank you. Hi.
Before I start asking questions, I would like to say thank you to our advertisers at H5 Strategies in Bucharest, political and executive consultancy specialized in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Central Asia. And now, before we start discussing current events, I would like Alexandru to tell us a little bit about his life experience and how he ended up as an expert in the region of Transnistria.
Quite accidentally, to be honest. When I was in my last year at the university, I was an intern at the Secretariat of the Moldovan Parliament. And then I think it was, 18 months after graduation, my internship supervisor called me and said, hey, there's a vacancy in the Moldovan government in the newly created Ministry of Reintegration. And it was back in 2003. And why don't you apply? Which I did and passed the interview and was employed as a junior civil servant at the, again, newly created Ministry of Reintegration. And the ministry was created, and the head of the ministry, the minister back then, because now it's a deputy prime ministerial position, are in charge of the overall political settlement of the Transnistrian conflict, and the head of the agency, the deputy prime minister at the time, also acts as Moldova chief negotiator in the talks. And so this is how it started almost 20 years ago. And since then, I've been working on, in, and about Transnistria all the time, nonstop.
I understand. Okay. And thanks for giving us that bit of background. Can we talk a little bit also about Transnistria itself to give people who might not know a bit of color? What is the economy like? What is the standard of living? What are the biggest activities, economic activities, that sort of thing?
I guess from London, the living standards in Transnistria and those in Moldova are comparable. There's nuanced differences that can only be seen from when you're here on the ground in either Chisinau, the capital of Moldova, or in Tiraspol in Transnistria. Wages are generally a bit lower in Transnistria, which I will further also refer to as the left bank, because there's a river separating Transnistria from the rest of Moldova. So the wages are a bit lower, but then on the bright side, they have extremely cheap public utilities and petrol for a number of reasons, which I understand we'll be talking about later. So yeah, comparable from a distance, I would say. And Moldova, note, is among the if not the poorest country in Europe, definitely poorer than any EU member state, even the like Bulgaria or Romania. Transnistrian economy is super monopolized. On one hand, they've inherited a number of industrial plants from the Soviet Union. Most of them collapsed. They were part of the so-called industrial military complex of the Soviet Union. So those collapsed, but also inherited energy sector enterprises, a huge power plant that operates on gas, Russian gas, Gazprom, also a steel plant, and a couple of others. And then there's that business empire, or as it often referred to, business conglomerate called Sharif, that controls virtually everything in Transnistria, from retail to fuel, telecom, and even has businesses in sports, like Moldova's many times, 10 times, I think, champion Sharif, Moldovan football championship. That's about it briefly. A big part of Transnistria's economy is shadow economy, and Transnistria's business model is based on two pillars. First pillar is the free Russian gas that the Transnistrians haven't been paying for since 2004, and the second pillar is smuggling. And when I say smuggling, it's petrol and diesel fuel, it's alcohol and tobacco products.
And before we get into the gas, because I want to ask a question about how the gas setup works, because it's a bit special. When you mention smuggling, shall we imagine that alcohol and tobacco and petrol and so forth that are produced in Transnistria end up in the European Union through smuggling?
Oh, no, they're not produced in Transnistria. They're imported from elsewhere, from all sorts of countries, and then they vanish, so to speak. That is, the goods are physically and officially, in many cases, with full respect to Moldovan legislation, with all the customs clearance, it's imported into the region, into the Transnistrian region, and then it's gone. It's gone on papers, it's gone physically, and cargo ends up in Moldova proper, in Ukraine, and in the EU too, especially when it comes to cigarettes and alcohol. Yes, much of that ends up in Europe.
Okay. And the gas. Transnistria has one of the biggest electricity generation plants in Eastern Europe, if not the whole of Europe. And it receives gas from Russia that it transforms into electricity, and it doesn't pay for the gas. You already said this was happening, but can we explain a little bit the arrangement with the gas, also because gas is a major concern at the moment for everyone, not just in Moldova?
Well, the arrangement is that there is no particular arrangement. There is only one legitimate importer of gas in Moldova, which is Moldova Gas Company, and I have to explain the setup and who owns the company. So 50% of the shares of Moldovan National Gas Operator are owned by Gazprom itself. Then 36% of shares owned by the Moldovan government. And then the rest, which is 13-point-something%, owned by the Transnistrian administration. But they transferred their shares to Gazprom. So effectively, Gazprom controls 2/3 of the company. And Moldova Gas is the only company that has a contract within Moldova that has a contract signed with Gazprom and is the sole official importer of that gas. Because of geography, because Transnistria is located at Moldova's eastern border, and this is where the pipeline enters Moldova through. So obviously the gas physical, I'm simplifying things, but just to explain how it works. So the gas that comes from Russia first enters Transnistria. They consume the amounts they need, in particular to operate their power plant, and then not only cover their own needs in electricity, but also they sell electricity to us, to the rest of Moldova. And then the remainder goes on the other side of the river. It's Moldova proper. And since 2004, Transnistrians have not paid a single penny for the gas they've consumed. So basically, it's just theft.
It's a subsidy, isn't it? It's because
Yes.
of the fact that Russia occupies, the Russian army occupies Transnistria, has been continuously present in Transnistria since '92, and the political leadership, the so-called political leadership there is allied to Moscow and it's subordinate to Moscow. Gazprom gives them this economic lifeline through gas, and it enables them to create free energy and also, I suppose, in extremis, control the supply of gas to Moldova, because if there were a conflict, I suppose that the Transnistrian would have the physical possibility of stopping gas flows to Moldova. Is that correct?
Yes, this is what they did back in the summer of 1992 during the war in Transnistria. They did indeed stop gas supplies to this side of the river. It is a form of subsidy from Moscow, and we're talking about almost 9 billion of US dollars worth of such kind of subsidies, and then divided by a population of roughly 300,000 people. It's a tiny region and tiny population, and 9 billion, almost $9 billion is a lot of money, even for all of Moldova. It is comparable to Moldova's GDP. It's not as much as Moldova's GDP, but it's comparable to Moldova's GDP. It is indeed a lot of money. I'd like to make two remarks here. In your introductory remarks, you said supposedly separatist region. It is a separatist region without discussion. It's part of Moldova that separated itself and proclaimed independence back in 1990 in violation not only of the international law, but also in violation of the constitution of the Soviet Union, which still existed back in September 1990 when Transnistria proclaimed so-called independence. And the other remark, you also said Russia invaded Moldova in 1992. Well, it didn't. Technically, the Russian troops had been there, they just never left. So Tsarist Russia troops, and then Soviet troops, and then after 1991, Russian Federation troops had been there, and after Moldova proclaimed independence, were supposed to leave the territory of a sovereign state that they were illegally deployed in, which obviously, as we know, never happened.
Right. Okay. Well, thanks for putting that straight. And
but yeah, indeed, that does not annul the fact that Russia was indeed involved in the 1992 war, and that explains why in what is usually being referred to as the ceasefire agreement signed by Moldovan and Russian presidents in July of 1992, where there was a particular article stipulating that Russian forces located in Moldova, in its Transnistrian region, would observe neutrality. There was a reason for that, because they had not observed neutrality during the war. And obviously, just like look at what happened in Donbass back in 2014. It was exact same scenario of what happened in Transnistria in 1992. Civilians all of a sudden in possession of Kalashnikovs, in possession of artillery systems, including multi-launch artillery systems like the ones used by the Russian troops in Ukraine as we speak. Suddenly in possession of tanks, and basically there was no explanation. They just happened to own tanks and Kalashnikovs and artillery systems. So yes, the war was provoked by Moscow and by the Russian troops. It was sustained by the Russian military, and it was stopped by Russian military when deemed appropriate and convenient for Moscow.
Right, of course. And just to clarify, when I said supposedly, I just meant that it wasn't an organic sort of grassroots separatist movement like
right.
in the UK.
Yes.
In the UK, we have separatists in Scotland. We have a Scottish National Party that wants to separate from the rest of the country and create Scotland as an independent country. And that's also separatism. But the difference, obviously, is that there's no foreign power, foreign nuclear power even, that is subsidizing and encouraging Scotland to become independent. So that's why I said supposedly, just because the separatism of Transnistria is sustained and encouraged by the Russians.
Okay, point taken, and I agree on that. It's linguistic nuances.
No, of course, and you know, language these days is a sensitive issue, so no worries. First of all, point taken on the semantics, and thanks for allowing me to clarify that. And I would like you to give us a brief list of the top 3 or 4 most important people in Transnistria. Who are the decision makers, the influencers, the politicians, the leaders? Who should we remember when we talk about Transnistria?
Well, the list is actually much shorter. I could limit it to just one name, that is Viktor Gushan, the owner or the co-owner of the Sheriff conglomerate of companies. There's a second co-owner named Ilya Kazmaly, but he has not been involved that much into politics lately. The two come from police background. Cops in their past founded the company back in the early 90s in Transnistria, and smuggling has been, at that point, especially in the 90s, smuggling was their main business operation, so to speak. All others, the public faces, because you, for example, you will not be able to find recent photos of Viktor Gushan on the web. The person is not public, does not talk to press. His security does not allow taking pictures of him, so you'll literally not be able to find pictures more recent than like 15 years ago, maybe even 20.
Well, that's quite interesting. So a very private
so the
man.
public faces, and yes, he is. The public names and the public faces, the people who make the so-called Transnistrian government, the so-called president and others, are in fact work for Sheriff Viktor Gushan, and he controls everything. In addition to that, I can't help but also mention that Russia, obviously, Moscow they have their own people in Tiraspol, and there's people in the security sector, in the military, who have their respective chains of commands in Moscow, not in Tiraspol.
Okay, right. That's interesting. And yeah, well, I've known how private Mr. Gushan is for several years. I've been writing about Moldova for about 10 years now, and a couple of times I phoned his underlings to try to get an interview or try to ask a few questions, and there was just no chance. And the last time I tried to do this was when Sheriff Tiraspol was playing in the Champions League in November, I think, or October last year. And again, they said there won't be an interview, there won't be a press conference, and my questions. I was working for a newspaper at the time. Our questions will not be answered. So there we are. But Sheriff Tiraspol is, as we have learned now, a big business conglomerate, which includes a football team. Could you talk a little bit about the football team? It was quite surprising for many in the West when the football team started playing Real Madrid and Inter Milan. And how come such a small and poor, internationally unrecognized enclave has generated such world-class competitive football? Was football a particular hobby of Transnistrian people since Soviet times, or what's the explanation?
No, football was and still is a particular hobby for Mr. Gushan personally, which is why he created the team at the end of the 90s. I think it was late 90s. Well, with the caveat that I myself am not a football fan and would not be able to talk much about sports itself, but the business and the political aspects of it. First, we need to explain that the Sheriff football team is a member of the Moldovan Football Federation and is otherwise a fully legitimate football team and legal entity. The team acts as a Moldovan legal entity and is a member of the federation. And it is in this capacity that the team participates in all sorts of European tournaments, wherever they can make it into. There are obviously questions, big question marks unanswered yet about the transparency of and the legality of funding of this football team. Because obviously, I mean, it's easy to make a miracle, even such a small country as Moldova is, and even in a smaller region as Transnistria is, when you have millions and millions and hundreds of millions of unaccounted cash. And so it just happened so that Victor Gushan is a big fan of football, and he had lots of money in cash back in the 90s when he made the team. And it is a business. It would be hard for me to tell whether or not it generates money for him, or it's just a hobby that he keeps paying for every year. But he can definitely afford buying players from a long list of African and South American countries, young, talented football players who can then grow in the European cups, and then they Sheriff sells those players to other teams in Europe.
Right. So I take two interesting aspects from this, and one is that it seems Mr. Gushan and Transnistria are very happy to be part of Moldova when it comes to football. There's no separatism. When it comes to football, the countries are united. Well, the country, because it's one country, the country is united. And
not only football, not only football, if I may, that applies to all sports. All Transnistrian sports people make part in their respective Moldovan sports federations, and they all participate in international tournaments under Moldovan flags.
Okay, that's very nice, because it shows that potentially in the future there is hope. It shows that these are somehow pragmatic people, and they're not totally obsessed with the idea of separatism.
Oh no, they're not, and I think we have to explain this to unprepared audience. Moldova Transnistria situation is nothing similar to conflicts in South Caucasus, for instance, or in the Balkans back in the 90s. There are no animosities among people. There is no religious or ethnic conflict. It's political conflict with the huge economic / business background and motivation to keep the conflict unresolved, because Transnistria's business model can only operate as long as the entity is not recognized for reasons we discussed above. But otherwise, people have no problem and no issue crossing the river, visiting each other, making families, playing football, or even organizing concerts on the other side of the river.
Right, and so I would like us to come back to present times now, and of course, Russia decided to try to conquer Ukraine, the whole of Ukraine, in February, and I would like you to say how you perceived the reaction in Transnistria to this invasion. What was the atmosphere like, and what are the concerns in Moldova around the potential annexation of Transnistria or potential involvement of Russian troops in Transnistria in the Ukrainian war, in the Ukrainian invasion?
That's actually many questions in
Sorry.
In one. Reaction in Tiraspol after February 24th was super cautious, because obviously Russia is the political patron of Transnistria and provides political, economic, and military support and cover to Transnistria. But there's Ukraine in between Transnistria and Russia. And that, by the way, is, to my mind, is the only explanation for why Russia has never recognized Transnistria and never tried to annex it. And the explanation is that they don't have a common border. So they just not be able to sustain it should Russians recognize Transnistria's so-called independence. So decision makers or the decision maker and his puppets in Tiraspol have been very cautious and mindful from the first days of the war. And they adopted their usual tactic, which they also used back in 2014, after Russia's annexation of Crimea and the war in Donbass. They just ignored anything is happening in Ukraine. No reports in the press about the war, no mention of the war. The only mention were the refugees, because many of Ukrainian refugees also ended up in Transnistria, including because many of them are originally from Transnistria. So many people just went back home to their parents' extended families. So yeah, there's refugees all of a sudden for no good reason. I mean, if you were to read Transnistrian press and follow their official public narrative, for no good reason, all of a sudden there's thousands of refugees from Ukraine, either transiting Transnistria or stopping in Transnistria. So they had to be, the Transnistrian leadership had to be cautious, and they never called it a war. They never called it a special military operation. They just avoided referring to it.
They pretended it didn't exist. Now, right. Sorry, I apologize. There's a bit of noise in the air conditioning or the heating system here, which is a bit annoying, but there we are. So they
it's good you have it. It's good. It's good you have it. It's good you have it.
Yes, well, quite, yeah. So they pretended that the war didn't exist, but in June, a man called Viktor Pleshkanov, who is, we should mention, he's just an ordinary man living in a block of flats. He's 58 years old, and he's not a known dissident or political player or anything like that. He was just a man who had a sense of humor, and he liked to speak out about things that that he didn't like, especially regarding the political situation in Transnistria. He liked to criticize the Transnistrian government, the so-called Transnistrian government, and express his verbal support for the Ukrainians who were suffering a great deal because of the invasion, because of the Russian aggression. And this man was arrested in June for displaying the Ukrainian flag on his balcony. And then the MGB, which is the local version of the KGB, the MGB, after they arrested him, they searched his house and they searched his computer and phone. And then on top of the accusation about the flag, they gave the case a bigger meaning by accusing Mr. Pleshkanov of extremism for expressing support for the Ukrainians in his online posts on Facebook mostly. And in September, he was sentenced by a Transnistrian so-called judge to 3 years and 2 months in prison. And I would like us to talk about this case a little bit, because I think, first of all, it's not right for ordinary people to suffer because they have certain opinions, and if they express their opinions peacefully, they shouldn't be put in prison. And secondly, because as you said, the Transnistrians were very anxious to ignore the war and not take part in Russia's campaign in any way. Now, could you give us your analysis of why they would have arrested Pleshkanov and what this means for the relationship between Tiraspol and Moscow?
It is exactly for the reasons stated above. The Transnistrian leadership pretends there's no war in Ukraine, nothing is happening, and they avoid taking any sides. And honestly, Mr. Pleshkanov was a disturbing factor, so to speak, speaking out loud about the war, condemning Russia. Look, you're an oligarch in a tiny separatist region of Transnistria, and your businesses and your prosperity depends on Russia's political support and depend on the degree to which Russia's happy with you running the region. So you don't want to annoy Russia. It also depends on your relationship with certain people in Ukraine, most specifically in Odessa, which is the closest large city to Transnistria and also large seaport, and also people in Kiev. So, and when you depend on people in Moscow, in Kiev, Odessa, but also on people in Chisinau, what you want is to avoid annoying those people. And the best way to keep everyone happy is keep silence and keep everyone silent and pretend nothing is happening, and make your money in the shade, so to speak. And obviously people like Pleshkanov, who speak out loud, who call things what they are, and call the aggressor and the war a war, and so on. They're disturbing the so-called public peace and public order, and they need to be neutralized. I mean, I'm using a bit of a cynical language. That's exactly where things are in Transnistria, and this is exactly how the decision makers in Trust perceive these things. The person has to be neutralized. Best way to put him in jail. Supposedly 3 years should be enough for the war to be over, and then who cares afterwards.
Okay, and so before I move on, I'd like to bring up our advertisers again. Thank you to H5 Strategies in Bucharest. It's a business and political advisory group specializing in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Central Asia. And I would like also to mention that this podcast is completely independent of the advertisers. They don't have any veto or involvement in the content or the questions or the guests, and that's all up to me. And we thank our advertisers for their trust and support. And now back to the subject at hand. So they thought that by putting Pleshkanov in prison, they would make him quiet and also encourage the rest of the population to stay quiet in order to avoid prison. Now, be that as it may, given that Pleshkanov was arrested for free speech, do you think he should be released? And do you think he got a fair trial? I was in touch with his lawyer, Mr. Pavel Kazakov from Promolex, and he said that he couldn't find, he couldn't obtain the sentencing documents and other important case documents, and the trial was held secretly, and that in general it's his legal opinion that this wasn't a fair trial. But I would like you to give us your opinion, and what do you think Tiraspol should do regarding Mr. Pleshkanov? And in general also, is there a fair justice system in Transnistria?
No, there does not exist fair and independent judiciary in Transnistria. I mean, Transnistrian courts just are anything but justice. And unfortunately, Mr. Pleshkanov is not a unique example. He is one in a long list of political detainees in Transnistria. The regime in Transnistria has always been repressive against opponents, against independent NGOs and media, and there has never existed a genuine or even apparent pluralism in Transnistria, which is why political parties in Transnistria don't exist. There's just one political party, which is why free press in Transnistria does not exist. It did. There was a couple of independent media outlets in late 90s, early 2000s, but the last decade, I think, all of the independent media has been shut down, and so were independent NGOs. So civic activism, political, so to speak, NGOs, human rights NGOs cannot operate freely in Transnistria. And you mentioned lawyer Pavel Kazakov, whom I happen to know pretty well. And Promolex is a Moldovan Chisinau-based NGO, which was banned on the territory of Transnistria. I think it was 2013. So for almost one decade, the key Moldovan human rights NGO with a particular focus on Transnistria has been unable to cross the river and travel to Transnistria to defend people, to document cases for that exact reason, because they do human rights and because the Transnistrian regime does not need NGOs doing human rights, because that interferes with their political and business interests.
Right. And in that context, what do you think outside partners of Moldova should do regarding Transnistria and regarding the case of Mr. Pleshkanov? I'm talking about Brussels, Washington, London, and various international NGOs, the United Nations, the government in Moldova. The spokesman for the Foreign Affairs Minister in Moldova told me that they've already filed complaints with the United Nations regarding Mr. Pleshkanov and other political detainees in Transnistria. What is your opinion about this?
Unfortunately, international organizations cannot help and have not been able of helping in the past in similar cases in releasing people, political detainees in Transnistria. Unfortunately, I mean, Transnistria obviously is not a member of any international organization and is outside of the control of the international law, so to speak, and is outside of the control of Moldova's constitutional authorities. So no legal instruments can be efficient in having political detainees released. It is only direct negotiations with Tiraspol combined with pressure, political and economic. Basically, we have to apply leverage on those people in Tiraspol, that particular person in Tiraspol who makes decision, and force the person to make the decision to release people. Unfortunately, it's only this way that can work. And guess what? If one person released, you have two more arrested the next day. So the point I'm trying to make is that there does not exist any good solution to the problem of political detainees in Transnistria, other than the resolution of this protracted conflict. and of reintegration of Transnistria into Moldova and return of this region into full legality provided by Moldovan constitution, Moldovan law, and international conventions that Moldova is party to.
Right. But of course, I take all these points, but the UK and the EU and the Americans as well have a Magnitsky regime of sanctions in place. And sometimes with these sanctions, they target people who they consider to have abused human rights.
Oh, excuse me, you're breaking up. Can you repeat the last sentence again, please?
Yes, sorry. So in London and Washington and Brussels, there's a Magnitsky sanctions regime in place, a sanctions program, and these sanctions often are targeting leaders that have been accused of abusing human rights. So, by this definition, you would think Transnistria's decision makers might be subject to sanctions because they tend to abuse human rights in Transnistria. And I just wonder, why do you think there have been no sanctions against Transnistria so far, and whether do you think there should be or not?
Well, in fact, there have been sanctions imposed against Transnistrian leadership by the EU at the request of the Moldovan authorities back in 2003 and 2004. In 2004, the EU imposed sanctions travel ban for a list of Transnistria's top political leadership, including the so-called president and members of the so-called government and other key decision makers for undermining the negotiation process. And then also in 2004, the list was extended. In fact, the EU, the Council of the EU, adopted an addendum to the initial sanctions decision for another violation committed by the Transnistrian regime, and that is the forceful closure of Romanian language schools in the region. And that closure happens with violent acts, with violence against children, the students of those schools and of their parents and their teachers. So, and the list was expanded and included more people directly involved into what was called the 2004 school crisis. As of now, those sanctions are still in place. It's just that the lists are blank. The names, because the situation has improved, both in the talks, or had improved at the point in time when the sanctions were suspended. In fact, technically, it wasn't even a suspension. These sanctions are still there. It's just that the list is empty. But to my mind, and as far as I know, there's people in Brussels who share same opinion. Or in fact, there is even a consensus. At any point, if there's a good reason for sanctions to be reintroduced against Transnistrian leadership, the Council of the EU can do that. So because the decision is still there, is valid since 2004. Nobody canceled it. It's just that the annexes with the names have to be approved by the Council.
Right, and so it turns out that in addition to the Magnitsky sanctions, there's also this previous tool that they have, which they could use. So, do you think they should use it in the case of Mr. Pleshkanov or not?
I think there's many more reasons to at least have this issue put on the agenda of the European Council. And it is up to the government of Moldova to request that. Because again, Pleshkanov is not a unique case. The list of political detainees in Transnistria is much longer. The list of abuses and human rights violations in Transnistria is also much longer. So should the Moldovan government decide to address the EU and ask that the decision be discussed, I see no reason why the EU, the Council, would not at least consider reimposing those sanctions. And even a travel ban would and could be quite an efficient tool. Because if you think of Transnistria, if you can picture Transnistria on the map, sandwiched between Ukraine and the rest of Moldova, with no ability to travel to the EU, and the EU is only 90 kilometers from where I am physically right now in Chisinau. So it is the closest destination, especially now with the ongoing war in Ukraine. There's little that people in decision makers in Tiraspol could or would want to do in Ukraine or even in Russia. Russia being under sanctions, many of the people in the so-called Transnistrian government and law enforcement and security have they own real estate in Europe, in countries like Cyprus, Spain, Germany. So without the ability to travel to those locations freely, those people would really be restricted in their freedom of movement. And if you think Transnistria is just a strip of land, something in between 12 and 25 kilometers wide, I mean, it's not too many destinations that you can travel to within Transnistria.
Yes, well, that's a very important point. And of course, on top of that, the football team now is an international financial player, because it sends and it receives international banking transfers from all over the world, including prestigious organizations such as the Champions League. So
correct.
That is potentially a target for sanctions as well, I would imagine. Of course, I don't know how it might turn out.
No, I think we have to differentiate between political people, or people who make political decisions that affect the broader public or certain individuals, limiting or violating their legitimate rights and freedoms stipulated in Moldovan legislation, provided for by the relevant international conventions. And so I have to make the difference between these people who are responsible for this kind of violations and sports, legitimate entities, whether a football team or a business operator. If it's a legitimate business and a legit legal entity that respects all relevant Moldovan legislation and by extension international legislation, while punishing the company, the possible sanctions have to be very targeted and target those who are indeed responsible for violations of human rights.
Right. Well, I suppose that's a very good point, because there's a similar thing happened with Chelsea London, and
right.
There were sanctions against the former owners of Chelsea, but the team carried on. The team never stopped its work, and the players weren't affected. The fans weren't affected. Well, some of the fans were a bit upset, but in the end, the team continued, and there's new ownership now.
Yeah, so, I mean, after all, it is not the football players' fault that Putin decided to invade Russia, and they may agree or disagree, and I suppose most, if not all of them, disagree with that and strongly condemn the aggression. So definitely no reason to punish the sports people for the violations that they did not commit.
And I would like to make you speculate a little bit, which you're probably not gonna like, but still. What would a victory of Ukraine in this invasion mean for Transnistria? So if the Ukrainian army drives out the Russian army and Ukraine regains its territorial sovereignty, what does that mean for Transnistria? And conversely, what does it mean if the Russians win? You know, the unthinkable happens and the Russians actually conquer Ukraine or southern Ukraine eventually.
To be honest, and that may not be necessarily obvious, but to my mind, it is my firm belief that the future of Transnistria is in Moldova's hands. It depends on us, on the government here, on the politicians here in Chisinau, more than on anyone else outside Moldova. What will happen to Transnistria in the near to midterm future? Whether or not Transnistria will continue being a separatist, unrecognized region, entity, or it will be part of Moldova again, and Moldova will restore its territorial integrity. Regardless of the outcome of the war in Ukraine, which is in itself not that obvious. I mean, a couple of hours ago, Putin decreed martial law in the newly annexed territories. So it's really hard to predict what the future dynamic of the war will be, or what the future of the war will be. The dynamic is unfortunately negative. We're seeing a sequence of escalating steps taken in by Moscow. But if Moscow were to, let's just imagine for a minute, if Moscow were to occupy all of Ukraine, it would hardly stop in Ukraine and not march all the way to NATO and EU border, which in our case is the border, Moldova's border with Romania. So, and I think that scenario was quite realistic in the first week of the war, and many people in Chisinau feared that was going to happen. And let us not forget that in the plans that Putin's generals presented to him before the war, they were supposed to march a parade on the central streets of Kiev, and 72 hours after the invasion. And if that was to happen, it would have taken them another 72 hours to march on the streets of Chisinau. Now, obviously, Ukrainian resistance and the overall dynamic of this war has put pressure on Putin and made him reconsider the war plan and consider new possible exit strategies. And unfortunately, there don't seem to be too many good face-saving options for Putin. And again, Putin is the kind of person for whom face savers matter more than substance. He could shoot himself in the foot just for the sake of a good face saver and the good narrative of him being the strong leader of the greatest nation on earth. So unfortunately, again, I understand your question was about Transnistria. I'm speaking more about the war in Ukraine, but I cannot ignore this, especially in the light of today's decision made in Moscow. I think the world is not getting any closer to peace at this point with the most recent decisions.
Right. Okay. Well, with that, I would like to conclude our podcast. I would like to say thanks again, and I hope some people out there who are listening and watching will have learned something new about Transnistria and about Moldova, which is an increasingly important part of the world. It's very important for Europe's security and therefore for global security. And so if any policymakers may have been listening as well, I think they should come to their own conclusions and perhaps focus a little bit more on Moldova and Transnistria in the context of the war in Ukraine. Thanks again, Alexandru, and thanks again to H5 Strategies in Bucharest, our advertiser, who is an executive and political advisor specialized in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Central Asia. All the best to you, Alexandru, in the future. Best of luck and every success.
Thank you.